There's gonna come a day when I have assembled my last piece of furniture and I am not gonna have to do this again.
I will still be here!
Well, I guess he was right about that. Constellation episode 4 has dropped, and it does get off to a slow start, but things really ramp up in the second half. So let's break this thing down and discuss all of the major takeaways after this episode titled The Left Hand of God. And real quick, if you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episode breakdowns. Let's get to it. The episode opens in an alternate present day where Magnus is still around and is hiking with Alice through the woods, talking about what they're going to do and where they might go. They eventually arrive at a cabin, which I believe is the same one we've been seeing in previous episodes with Alice and Joe. Alice says she's nervous, and Magnus says, "You're not going to see her again, you know that, right?" This definitely seems to indicate that Joe isn't the only person seeing both realities, and that perhaps the reason Alice is scared of Joe is that she's quite literally being haunted by her. Next, we're back in time at Joe's home where they're celebrating her birthday. Later in the evening, Magnus says they didn't leave things in a good way before Joe went to space, which confuses Joe because that's not how she remembered it. Magnus then asks if Joe still loves him, and she says of course she does. That night, Joe has a dream of being back up in the space station, but I believe this is actually a sort of vision through the eyes of the other Joe that's still up there. I think they're tethered together and see things the other one is seeing, and possibly even swapping places, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a moment. The following day, Joe returns to work at the ESA, and that night Joe and Magnus discuss what specifically happened that bothered him before she left. Magnus says he was beginning to wonder about Joe and Frederick, and she denies having an affair, and Magnus then says that he dated someone while Joe was gone, but they only had drinks and kissed once. Next, we see Henry at work where he writes stress trauma, lithium-7, and death in space on a whiteboard, which is going to prove to be a rather important plot device later in this episode, and possibly even the remainder of the show. We're then back on the ship with Bud, where the captain announces an incident with a missing passenger, and they have to make a stop while they try to sort it out. During this announcement, we can see FBI agents making their way on board the ship. Back with Henry, Michaela says the cowl experiment failed, and the project is being shut down, and he'll need to come back home. Next, Joe meets with a psychiatrist and tells her that things don't seem to be how she left them, like the color of her car and the fact that there's a piano in her home which she doesn't even play. She goes on to say that she also sees Paul, or at least his ghost, and that sometimes she feels like she's still up there at the space station, which again indicates to me that sort of tether between her and the other version of herself. The doctor tells Joe this sounds like PTSD and that she'll prescribe her lithium to calm things, which is interesting considering lithium is what Henry had written on his whiteboard. More on this in a bit. Henry meets Joe outside her appointment and asks if she'd like to see the cowl experiment. Joe says she doesn't remember much about the cowl before the accident, which makes me think this Joe wasn't in space with a cowl device like the one that's still up there. He tells Joe about members of another crew that also experienced weird things in space, and while he's talking, she notices what he had written on his whiteboard, piquing her interest after having just been prescribed lithium by her doctor. Henry goes on to talk about the phenomenon known as the left hand of God that pilots used to feel when flying at high altitudes. He tells a story about a man who heard his dead son speak to him while flying, then asks Joe if she's ever seen anything weird. Before she answers, the cowl experiment starts running again, and Joe experiences the same strange headache that she had experienced before when being around the cowl device. We then see a very short clip of what looks like another Joe in space with a bandaged up face. It's now making sense why Joe is grabbing her face during these events. I believe that during the accident at the space station, Joe's face was injured, and anytime this Joe feels a connection or link to the other one, she's experiencing and feeling the same pain from that injury. Back on the ship, Bud places a phone call to someone, maybe a granddaughter by the sound of it, and he goes on about needing to contact someone, and the other person says it's basically all in his head and that he just needs to take his medication. The same lithium medication that we've seen everyone else taking. Joe and Magnus meet with Alice's teacher, who says Alice is exhibiting strange behavior like hiding in cabinets and talking about death. The teacher, Magnus's colleague, seems to know a lot about them, indicating that she's likely the one Magnus was hooking up with while Joe was away. Also during this conversation, the teacher says Alice is in a liminal space between the age of 9 and 10, which is interesting because the last time this word was used, Henry was explaining a particle being somewhere in the middle of black and white in a liminal space. I think the reuse of this specific word, liminal, is a good indicator of what's going on in this show and likely what's to come in future episodes. Back at home, Joe's going through old clothes to give to Alice but can't find her. She heads to the spare room and finds Alice hiding in a wardrobe again. Joe asks Alice not to shut her out and that they should go on a trip together. I'm thinking the trip they go on is the one we see in present day out at the cabin, and that she goes on this same trip in the alternate reality with her dad. Henry meets with another scientist over FaceTime and discusses the results of the experiment, which the other man says were an error and that Henry didn't build a bridge to another universe. Henry goes on to say that he believes the experiment affects the observer and how they perceive reality. I think there's likely a lot of importance in what Henry is saying here. I'm honestly not even entirely sure what it could mean for our characters. It might mean that anyone exposed to the running Cal device gives them the ability to see things in multiple ways, much like when Henry was explaining superpositioning and the observer effect to Alice on the swing set. Back at home, Jo sits back down at her piano. This time, however, she knows how to play and read music. It seems that her recent re-exposure to the Cal experiment may have swapped her again with the Jo in the alternate reality, or somehow allowed her to access memories or abilities of her other self. Back on the ship, Bud is golfing when the FBI questions him about the missing man, which Bud appears to successfully deflect, at least for the time being. Jo opens up her prescription and finds that the pills match the same vitamins given to her after her physical exams, so she takes them into the office to test them. As she's walking through the hall, she hears Henry having a conversation with someone saying, "I want us to agree on what's causing this. Convince me I'm not going insane," which will be important here in just a minute. Jo tests the pills and finds they are, in fact, the same serotonin inhibitor lithium medication. She heads to her desk to look into things and finds that she's been given a different vitamin than everyone else on her crew, then finds others from the past who were given the same pills as her, who also reported seeing strange things in space, one of which was Henry. During the time in her office, men enter the room to clear things out because I believe Jo is seeing into the alternate reality where they believe she died up in the space station and are clearing out her things. She tries to interact with the men, but they don't notice her until she stands in front of one of them and he sees her for a brief moment before disappearing and leaving Jo alone once again in her office. Jo goes to meet with Henry and he appears to be speaking to himself through a reflection and says, "If you hadn't been so curious, none of this would have happened." Then turns to Jo and says, "Curiosity killed the cat." I've watched this multiple times, and while it's clear there are 2 Henrys here, I'm now wondering if we're dealing with 3. We've got Bud on the cruise ship, and the Henry we've seen the whole time, and now this creepy dude talking to Henry. Once again, going back to the swing set conversation, Henry said one particle could be in 2 places at once, black in one and white in the other, but then another in the middle where it's both black and white. Could this third Henry be the black and white version? I'd love to know what you all are thinking about this idea and what's going on with Henry here, so let me know down in the comments. The following day, Jo meets with Frederick, who says he still wants Jo as much as before and wants them to work out their contracts and then move away together. But Jo clearly has no idea what he's talking about and no interest in going with him. Jo then speaks to Alice's class and connects the dots that Magnus and his coworker had something else going on, and she storms out. Jo attempts to drive them home, then grabs her face in pain as she nearly wrecks the car. We then see the FBI agent looking over the security footage from Bud's cruise ship, but she sees the same shape the Cal device creates, and Bud and Ian disappear from the footage. Now, I went back to the last episode to see if I might figure out why this happened, but nothing's really standing out. So my assumption is that this is going back to what Henry's been saying about the observer effect and that the Cal experiment has exposed something that doesn't want to be seen by everyone, preventing the FBI agent from seeing what really happened that night on the ship. Frederick arrives at Jo's place and Magnus asks if they had an affair, and Frederick says yes. Jo asks him to leave and Magnus also storms out. Jo then finds some mail that has a letter and a tape of a recording of herself in space, and another, which is from the 60s, where there was an accident leading to the death of a cosmonaut. All right, I'm cutting in as kind of another version of myself from a different timeline. I had finished recording, but then I was like, I think there's more to this tape scene that I may have missed, so I rewatched it and did a lot of pausing on these letters that we got, and man, this is a big deal. I'm glad I came back to revisit it. So on this first letter, it says it's from the Skagerrak, I'm probably mispronouncing that, Marine Observatory. And it says in this first line, it's cut off, but it says, "You do not know us." And then it goes on to say something about they think she should hear this. And they talk about how they heard her on the ISS on October 15th, and then another recording that they're providing her from 1967, where this other cosmonaut had died. But then it says, "We know your secrets. If you wish to hear the tapes more clearly, you must come to us." So, like I said, I think this is a pretty big deal. I would imagine we'll see more about this in future episodes. It's interesting to me, the wow factor in this letter, and if you didn't pause your show long enough to see it, you would have never caught it. And that's not even it. If you look at the transcript from the 1967 recording, at the very bottom, it says, "The world is the wrong way around." Now, I still believe the recording on this tape is Irene from previous episodes, and I talked about that in my last video. Much like Joe, I think there was a version of her left up in space that ended up dying and is what crashed into the space station, and then the other version that came down to space and is the one that we've been seeing in the show. So yeah, I thought it was important to come back and record this bit and talk about this because it is pretty vital information. All right, back to the other me. While listening to the recordings, Alice comes downstairs to find a bunch of people in her home, including Paul and another version of herself, and what looks like a funeral for Joe. Yet again, showing another reality where Paul survived and Joe never made it back. Magnus tucks Alice into her cabinet, then argues with Joe downstairs about taking medication, and he says he's going to call Frederick to get her some help. Joe doesn't like this and pushes Magnus down, where he hits the piano, and based on what Alice said in prior episodes about what Joe did with her dad, I'm assuming he's dead. Interestingly, Magnus's left eye is what hits the corner of this piano, matching the injury we saw on the other Joe up in the space, and is the same eye Joe grabs when she's having one of her episodes. I doubt this is coincidence, and I'm very interested to see how all these things will connect in future episodes. Things wrap up as we zoom into the strange painting of the demon-looking character in the cabin. All right, as I said back at the beginning of this video, the latter half of this episode was intense. We've got a lot of mystery behind these lithium-7 pills, the various versions of Henry, whatever's going on with Joe's eye, and now the death of Magnus, at least in this reality. Going back to the beginning of the episode, we saw Magnus and Alice going to the cabin and Magnus telling her she wouldn't see Joe again, and I was about to theorize that Magnus killed Joe in another reality, and maybe he did, but I suppose it's probably more likely that Joe isn't there because she's still trapped up in space and presumed dead by everyone down on Earth. Now, I've seen several comments that say this is just another multiverse show, and I have to say that I couldn't disagree more. While I definitely don't know entirely what's going on here, this certainly feels different than the typical multiverse stories we've been seeing for the past several years. And I think the superpositioning and observer effect that Henry keeps talking about is going to be the major differentiator between this story and all the others kind of in the same genre. I'm still absolutely loving this show, and I cannot wait to dig into episode 5 with you guys, so please let me know your thoughts on this episode down in the comments, and of course, please share all of your theories. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.